Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive historical question. How did the war to end all wars become, well, just the prequel to an even bigger, deadlier conflict? It's like a story of carefully placed dominoes, each one tipping over the next, leading us straight to the brink of World War II. Now, this quote, it's not just a clever line. It's a whole new way of looking at the 20th century. It asks us to stop thinking about two separate world wars and instead see it as one, single, devastating 30-year crisis with a very fragile and very deceptive break in the middle. So to really understand how World War II exploded onto the scene, we have to go back to the smoldering embers of the first one. As Winston Churchill so perfectly put it, we need to examine the gathering storm. On the surface, the Roaring Twenties seemed like one big global party. You had jazz, new technologies, a feeling of freedom, but underneath all that celebration, the peace treaty itself was a ticking time bomb. The wounds from the first war, they weren't healing. They were getting infected, just festering below the surface, ready to erupt. And the fuse for that bomb, well, you could say it was lit right here, in the Grand Palace of Versailles. Kind of ironic, isn't it? The treaty that was supposed to guarantee peace for good would actually end up planting the seeds for the next war. Just think about how powerful that statement is. This is the guy who led Germany into the First War. He's in exile. He looks at this treaty, and he doesn't see a resolution. He sees a blueprint for the next conflict, and man, he was tragically right. And this slide right here shows you exactly why. These weren't terms for a lasting peace. These were terms of humiliation. They were designed to cripple Germany. And that war guilt clause, that was a big one. It basically forced an entire generation of Germans to accept the blame, creating this deep well of national resentment that extremists would later tap into. The economic punishment was it was beyond catastrophic. It led to something called hyperinflation. I want you to just try and imagine this. Your entire life savings, everything you've ever worked for, becomes worthless, literally overnight. This economic chaos didn't just hurt people's bank accounts, it completely shattered their faith in Germany's new democratic government, making it look totally powerless. And all this chaos simmering inside Germany, it created the absolute perfect conditions for the next global catastrophe to strike, the Great Depression. You see, in the 1920s, the entire global economy was basically a house of cards. It was all propped up by this really shaky cycle of American loans. As you can see here, it was a super fragile system, and when the foundation in America crumbled in 1929, the whole thing just came crashing down. When Wall Street crashed, that money tap was just slammed shut, and it plunged the entire world into a brutal economic depression. And what happens then? You get this massive void where hope and certainty used to be. People were desperate, and in desperate times, people start looking for saviors. And in Germany, you can see that desperation right here, in the voting numbers. Just look at the insane, sudden jump for Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. They went from being this tiny fringe group to a major political force almost overnight, just by feeding on all that public fear and anger. And this kind of desperation, it wasn't just happening in Germany. Across the globe, you had these charismatic and totally ruthless leaders rising up to fill that void of certainty. And all of these men, they offered a similar, very seductive promise. National strength, a return to glory, and simple answers to really complex problems. They were masters at preying on fear and resentment, using powerful propaganda to rally the desperate masses. Now, what's really fascinating is that even though they were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, the two most powerful regimes, Hitler's Nazism and Stalin's communism, they shared a terrifying core belief: totalitarianism. This meant they wanted to control every single aspect of society, what people read, what they thought, what they believed. Total control. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, another empire was on the move, Japan. They also felt they got a raw deal from the post-war settlement, so they began their own brutal expansion into China. This was creating a second parallel crisis that was on a collision course to merge with the one brewing in Europe. So, this is the critical question, isn't it? With the whole world on a knife's edge, what did the victorious powers from World War I do? The nations that were supposed to be the guardians of that fragile peace, what was their move? They responded with a policy that would become one of the most infamous words of the entire 20th century: Appeasement.
Okay, now it is so easy for us to look back and just see appeasement as cowardice. But at first, it was born from this tragically misguided sense of fairness. A lot of Allied leaders genuinely believed the Versailles Treaty had been way too harsh. They thought if they just satisfied what they saw as Hitler's reasonable demands, to get back German-speaking lands, they could prevent another catastrophic war.
But as this timeline shows so clearly, every concession just fed Hitler's appetite for more. He would repeatedly break his promises, tear up treaties, and just take more territory. Appeasement wasn't preventing war, it was making it inevitable.
After basically sacrificing Czechoslovakia to Hitler at a conference in Munich, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came home to a hero's welcome. He literally waved this piece of paper declaring that he had secured peace for our time. It's just one of the most tragically ironic moments in modern history.
So what's the big takeaway here? The road to World War II wasn't some sudden swerve off a cliff. It was a long, devastating chain reaction. It was a perfect storm of unresolved anger from the First War, an economic collapse that fueled extremism, and a catastrophic failure of diplomacy to stand up to aggression. And it leaves us with a really chilling, really vital question. At what point did the chance for peace truly disappear and the march to war become unstoppable?